All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I do not know what episode. This is episode 41, actually, I believe. We are in the 40s. We are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power by Steve Herbert, and we are on chapter 3. Let's just dive right into this. Chapter 3, Elusive Legitimacy, Subservient, Separate, or Generative. It is the regular monthly meeting of a neighborhood council in Eastside. The neighborhood in question covers about a single square mile. Its residents are mostly middle-class homeowners, although there are also many multi-family dwellings. The racial composition of the neighborhood is majority white, but a sizable minority population exists, comprising primarily Latinos and Asians. In its meetings, the council addresses a fairly typical set of concerns: speeding cars on residential streets, possible negative externalities from a homeless shelter at a church, blighted homes, occasional graffiti. Because public safety concerns invariably form part of each meeting's agenda, a representative of the Seattle Police Department usually attends. The officer is usually included as a standing item on the agenda, typically to summarize recent crime events and to solicit questions and input from the residents. On this night, the SPD representative is a lieutenant whose responsibilities include supervision of the precinct's community policing team. After describing significant recent crimes in the area, the lieutenant asks for questions. One woman asks about a possible recent spat of car thefts from her block and wonders whether the lieutenant can confirm this statistically. The lieutenant claims ignorance, citing the fact that he only recently assumed his post. He does, however, reinforce the idea that the neighborhood is an attractive spot for car thieves. As an aside, he tries to explain this phenomenon in terms of the large number of, quote, unsupervised youth, end quote, in the area. This comment prompts a question. Asks one resident, quote, what happens to these kids when they are caught stealing a car, end quote. The lieutenant leans into his microphone and in a stern voice says, quote, I'm going to tell you the truth, and is going to irritate everyone in this room, end quote. He says that essentially nothing will happen to these kids because the youth detention facility will not jail overnight a car thief or any other nonviolent offender. As a result, a car thief will, quote, never see a minute, end quote, in jail until after the 15th arrest, when he might get 10 days. The lieutenant describes this as, quote, one of the weak links in the system, end quote. The only sound in response is a muttering in seeming support of the lieutenant's indignation. And then that brings us to a switching of subjects. And I won't dive into. Okay, I will say this: if a kid is out stealing a car, that is an effect. That is not a cause, and the cause of a kid stealing a car, a child killing a car can be a multitude of things. But as we have just outlined in the previous two chapters and as we've done in previous books as well, a lot of the circumstances that these children grow up in, the environment that these children and these teenagers grow up in, is what provides them the opportunity to engage in things such as stealing cars. So I just think that that's something important to point out. Community policing and the ideal of police responsiveness. The legitimacy of community policing rests in significant part upon the long-treasured ideal of localized democracy. To self-actualize, citizens should come together and exert meaningful influence over the policy matters that affect them. Community policing can be legitimated as such an opportunity for urban residents to act in their collectively defined best interests. As we have seen, various impediments can render this vision illusory for urban neighborhoods. But even if neighborhoods could develop greater political capability, they would still need to exert sway over a state agency like the police. In other words, the police would need to integrate public input into their practices. They would need, to some extent, to render themselves subservient to the citizens they police. The police, like all state agencies, stand in fundamental connection to the citizenry. They exist to provide service to the population. But, as with all state agencies, the precise nature of the relationship between police officers and the citizens they serve is not so straightforward. As with the political role of community, This is a matter of both normative theory and sociological reality. There is normative confusion about how state and society should relate, and there are significant on-the-ground dynamics that shape how these relations play out. In this chapter and the next, I seek to make this complex reality more clear. Much of this complexity is attributable to different idealized models for state-society relations, each of which possesses tremendous legitimacy. For instance, the general narrative of democracy suggests that state agencies like the police should be responsive to public input. They should do as they are directed by the citizenry. In such fashion, the state should understand itself as primarily subservient to its constituents. However, the narrative of liberalism suggests that state agencies must possess a necessary autonomy from public input, the better to protect the rights of all citizens against the possibility of unjust majoritarianism. The state should strive towards some degree of neutrality, loyally primarily to the abstract rule of law. Otherwise, the rights and needs of the more marginalized will likely be threatened. For these reasons, the state must understand itself as importantly separate from society. Yet respect for the rule of law is not the only means by which such state separation can occur. State actors often consider themselves possessors of unique bases of knowledge and authority. They thereby distinguish themselves from those they govern and assert that distinction in their daily practice. The police, for example, embrace the image of professional crime fighters, and they often expect deference to their unique authority. Separation here dons a professional guise and significantly structures state-society relations. But subservience and separation do not exhaust the possibilities for the state-society relation. One could also argue that the state is generative of community. That is because the state, with its policies, helps determine the central characteristics of communities. Further, the state only understands, quote, community, end quote, in particular ways, through the routines and epistemologies state actors use to filter public input. State actors also often characterize their work in terms of an overarching moralism that situates both state and society on a transcendental plane. This is particularly true of police officers, who thereby construct community as an entity in need of the protection that only their virtuous vanguard can provide. The lieutenant's performance at the neighborhood council meeting displays all these modes of relation. To an extent, the lieutenant is being subservient. He takes time to come to the meeting. He provides information he thinks the residents will find useful. He opens himself up to questions and discussion. He reinforces the implicit assumption that, as a public servant, he must make himself available to the citizenry and engage them on matters of public safety. This nod to subservience is, however, This nod to subservience is, however, not all that characterizes the lieutenant's behavior. He also positions himself as separate. He sits at the front of the room in full uniform and speaks in an authoritative voice. Behind him stands the majesty of the law, the rights it protects, the duties that it imposes. He acts as if his authority is unquestionable. This sense of autonomous authority is exasperated by the emotional and rhetorical force of his utterance. Already an intimidating force, bedecked as he is with uniform badge and a belt full of coercive tools, the lieutenant imposes himself further with his presentational style. He physically and symbolically sets himself apart from the public. Yet the performance is also generative. The lieutenant invokes implicit notions of both the community and the larger moral terrain upon which he situates his work. Community, in other words, is not separate from the state. Rather, it is something that state actors, like the lieutenant, produce in their work. They render society sensible through certain organizational routines and moral architectures. In the lieutenant's case, it is his moral architecture that is most evident. Note the manner by which it leads him to assume a commonality in the group about his viewpoint. He says it will, quote, irritate everyone in the room, end quote, because he believes everyone agrees that car thieves should be tracked down and removed to jail. He implicitly suggests that anyone who disagrees is suspect. The lieutenant's moral understanding renders the community a set of passive, like-minded good people who deserves better protection from the criminal justice system. Thus, even though there were at this meeting elements of police responsiveness to the public and a sense in which the police were open to accountability, the lieutenant was not especially subservient. He used his institutional stature and his emotional rhetoric to short-circuit rather than promote debate about crime control policy. This was therefore not an instance of a vibrant project of deliberative democracy. Even though the lieutenant likely considers himself responsive to the citizenry, he does not approach the gathering as an open, respectful dialogue between similarly situated people. Rather, he constructs himself as society's protector and asserts his unique authority to quell a moral plague that troubles the otherwise peaceful community. The lieutenant's performance is something of an overdrawn example, but it represents a pattern that was invariably repeated at police community forums. Almost never did a police official seriously interrogate any suggestions from the public that the organization reorient its priorities or practices. Recall another lieutenant's performance at the Weed and Seed meeting described in the introduction. In that case, the lieutenant less loudly, but no less effectively, controlled the conversation by deflecting recommendations from the public. His use of these strategies may not have been entirely conscious, but it was effective nonetheless. In an interview, however, a precinct captain did acknowledge his desire to retain tight control over an upcoming community forum. If he surrendered any control, he suggested, he would get his, quote, ass lit up, end quote. Similarly, after one such public meeting, another precinct captain expressed pleasure with how the meeting went. There was little discussion after his presentation, and thus little need to respond to public concerns. Such lack of enthusiasm for meaningful engagement with citizens obviously stands in opposition to the normative, democratic thrust of community policing. In this chapter, I illustrate how the police invoke different understandings of their relationship to the community and how these do not necessarily cohere. Most of all, I show how the police understand themselves as importantly separate from society. Of the three paths to state legitimacy outlined above, the police favor a self-understanding that emphasizes their autonomy. However, this is justified or perpetuated in terms other than those envisioned by liberal theorists. Although they do see themselves as neutral enforcers of an abstract, objective law that is ideally applied equally to all citizens, officers more robustly build a self-construction as members of a politically embattled institution whose unique base of expertise needs protection from the uninformed meddling of biased community activists. From this perspective, the police must stand separate from society because otherwise they will be enmeshed in political machinations that will negatively affect them. Officers repeatedly state a fear of being sacrificed on the altar of, quote, politics, end quote, and thus seek to stiff-arm public participation to avoid that fate. A complete explanation for why this is the case must wait until Chapter 4. For now, the task is to understand how the police pursue and balance the drives to be subservient, separate, and generative. Okay, and that brings us to a stopping point in this chapter. I think one of the first things that stands out to me, one of the first things that stood out to me was the interaction between the police lieutenant and the community and the manner in which he engaged the community, the manner in which that he spoke at the community. And I think that it was, and I like the analysis that Steve laid out here as well when he began to analyze how the police officer separated himself from the members of the community by coming in uniform, by sitting at the front, by the tone in which he spoke. And that's something that we've seen happen multiple times. At the very beginning of this, when we read about the Weed and Seed meeting in the introduction, I spoke about how we recently went to body camera meetings, or how we recently went to meetings that were held in the community about the procedure and policy of body cameras that have been implemented by the Rockford Police Department, and how there was a lack of community engagement there, how there were only a handful of community members there, how it was just a handful of people outside of the police department or media or even activists that were there, and how I said, in my opinion, I believe that that's something that's purposely done, that they purposely go out their way to not get more people to come to these meetings because they want that separation, because they want that image of themselves to be separate from the community. They want the image of themselves to be above the community. I think one of the things that also stands out in this is the lack of the lack of desire to have human interactions with people. That's one of the things that I think that is very, very noticeable when you see people interacting with the police, or when you have interactions with the police, is how many things that they do that are almost robotic like, or just like systematically, and all empathy or understanding is removed. And I'm sure that that's not the case for everybody. So there are some people who, based on the neighborhoods they live in, the communities that they are part of, the class that they are part of, the race that they are part of, don't have that type of an interaction with police. Police officers may not see them immediately as being criminals, or see them immediately as being numbers. But there are a set of people in certain neighborhoods and in certain races where their interactions with police go right past any type of human interaction or any type of empathetic understanding interaction, and it goes straight to a criminalizing interaction, or a dehumanizing interaction, or a systematic sort of type interaction. And I think that also one of the things that he pointed out here that I want to go back to is the idea that everybody in the room, when he spoke about how people should be upset because this is a flaw in the system that's not working, because these kids weren't sitting in jail for the stealing of the cars. And I think that that's one of the things that happens a lot of times too, is that police officers, when they speak, they try to project their opinions onto and their beliefs onto the room or the crowd that they're speaking to. And as opposed to coming and having a dialogue or a conversation with people in the community, and actually being open to what it is that other people's perception or viewpoints are. And I think another, and I'm sort of in some manner or another sort of repeating the same things, but I think another one of the things that stands out to me here is the lack of desire for engagement that police officers also have. They don't want to have these community meetings. They don't want to understand what the community that they're policing, what their beliefs are, ideologies are, what things they think can help make things better. They want to have this illusion that they protect and serve. They want to have this illusion that they're there to help and they're there to assist, but they want to only help and assist and protect and serve on their own terms, not on in a parasitic manner, not in a symbiotic manner. And so here, let's keep on reading. Let's try to knock out another passage here. The police community connection, a normative approach. Even if concerns about the political capacity of community could be allayed, it remains uncertain how any communal group can and should interact with the state agency, such as the police. What should be the balance of power between a community group and the police? Should the community direct what the police do, or should the community play second fiddle, acting only via police directive? Or is a genuine partnership even possible, one in which the balance of power is equilibrated? How to strike a balance between subservience, separation, and generativity. There's both normative and sociological heft to each of these approaches to the state-society connection. Each possesses legitimacy, and each influences interactions between communal groups and the police. It is therefore difficult to assess just how communities should interact with state agencies like the police. In this section, I'll review each of these three approaches in a bit more depth and outline how each shapes how one might construct an ideal balance of power between community groups and the police. Subservient. Iris Marion Young states succinctly the case for citizen influence over the policy-making process. Quote, "The normative legitimacy of a democratic decision depends on the degree to which those affected by it have been included in the decision-making process and have had their opportunity to influence the outcomes." End quote. Implicit in this normative formulation is an active citizen who deserves a place at the table at which policy is generated. Without so respecting the agency of its citizens, a state is not legitimate, according to democratic theorists like Young. A state must ensure that its dictates possess the imprimatur of the people it serves. Excuse me, sorry about that. It must respect the capacity for self-determination that inheres in each citizen. This is particularly critical when one considers the coercive power state agencies possess, none more obviously than the police. As noted by such important theorists as Weber, Durkheim, and Habermas, coercion is an insufficient basis for rule. Exercises of coercive power must invoke some greater good, some communally supported ideal. Otherwise, power is nakedly exposed and loses legitimacy. Citizen control of state agencies that exercise coercive power is thus critical to democratic states' quest for legitimacy. Such an assumption helps legitimate community policing. Recall that community policing efforts developed in response to tensions between the professionalized police and urban communities. Professional police were seen as too aloof and too often aggressive, orbiting somehow above the everyday concerns of citizens. Such citizens were not recognized as possessing a legitimate need to direct police operations. Rather, they were adjuncts to police operations, and their input was narrowly channeled by the dictates of professional practice. By contrast, legitimations of community policing are full of language of, quote, co-production, end quote, and of, quote, partnerships, end quote. Language that heralds a citizenry active in the construction of police policy. An engaged and active citizenry can exercise self-determination through shaping the police's use of the state's coercive power. The language of democracy thus reinforces the legitimacy of community policing. The police need to be responsive to the will of the community. Such an active citizenry is also endorsed by theorists of crime and social control who recognize the fundamentally communal nature of deviant activity. If crime and disorder develop from communally based social patterns, then these patterns must be addressed. Such a logic, for example, drives various restorative justice programs. The goal here is to respond to deviance by reestablishing communal connections. Deviant behavior is, by definition, a violation of communal norms. The goal in response could be to reestablish these norms and to reincorporate the offender into the fold. Implicit here is a notion of community members as effective agents who assume responsibility to reinforce bonds frayed by deviance. In sum, a strong version of community power suggests that communal agents are primarily responsible for ensuring social control. They do this by reestablishing connections to those who deviate and by assuming a muscular role in overseeing the formal social control efforts of the police and other relevant state agencies. From this view, the police must understand themselves as importantly subservient to the community. They must avail themselves of public input, enable citizens to help construct police policy, allow citizen groups to evaluate their performance. Without such responsiveness, the police's quest for legitimacy might well suffer. There is thus a push from many quarters to open up the police to oversight from citizenry through such vehicles as police review boards. At the neighborhood level, this could mean partnerships that are more genuinely shared projects of governance, not police-run exercises that marginalize community input. In these and other ways, the police are seen as within the parameters of citizen oversight. Okay, and then that brings us to the end of subservient. And one of the things I want to point out is that has been since May 30th of 2020. That has been something that the city has spoken as if they are in the process of putting together a citizen overview board or a citizen review board of the police. But I think one of the things that's important to talk about, or important to point to when we start speaking about creating a citizen review board of the police, is what type of power that citizen review board will have. The one that they were creating here was essentially one that would have no power. Also, they were in the process of trying to put police officers on the citizens review board. And so I think that that's one of the reasons and this is a citizens review board would be a kind of reform. And I want to make sure that when I speak about how reform is not the answer or the solution, that people don't take that to mean that I believe that overnight, all of a sudden, there will be no more police, or overnight, all of a sudden, that these issues will be addressed and absolved. There has to be pieces and steps made. And I think that the problem with the concept of reform is that reform paints it and makes it seem as if one step is the solution, when in reality, these things that they are calling reforms should be just steps to creating new institutions, to creating new systems within those institutions. And so the Citizens Review Board that is being put together here was in the process of being put together here, and I'm sure this is happening all over the country, is an act of reform. And so what we have to make sure to do is that you don't allow the city or the institution of policing in the place that you're from to think that just simply putting together a Citizens Review Board means that you've solved the problems of police terrorism. The Citizens Review Board needs to have power. The Citizens Review Board needs to be able to subpoena. The Citizens Review Board needs to be able to implement punishment for police officers. And I don't know if punishment is the right word, but implement accountability for police officers. The Citizens Review Board needs to have access to police policies and procedures and to police reports. There's a litany list of things that if a Citizens Review Board is put together properly, they must have. And very often one of the things that I've seen here is the Citizens Review Board. Very often one of the things I've seen in other places, here they haven't even got to the point of having a Citizens Review Board. But one of the things I've seen in other places often is these review boards being put together and them having no power. But the city can say, hey, we gave you a Citizens Review Board, or hey, we have this Citizens Review Board, but they can't void out a justified shooting verdict from the police department or from the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force. They can't subpoena evidence. They can't implement accountability. And so that's a Citizens Review Board that has no teeth, that is powerless. And we have to be in a position right now where we are only putting together, whether it's a Citizens Review Board or an organization or whatever it is bases of power. We need bases of power being put together. So that's one of the thoughts that I have from reading Subservient. I think also the concept here that it says, okay. In sum, a strong version of community power suggests that communal agents are primarily responsible for ensuring social control. They do this by reestablishing connections to those who deviate and by assuming a muscular role in overseeing the formal social control efforts of the police and other relevant state agencies. And I think that one of the parts of community that we've touched on and that we've spoken about before is an invested interest. In the previous chapters, the invested interest of the community of a neighborhood was security and was familiarity. And so I say that to say that when you start thinking about how ways of ensuring community protection or ways of ensuring neighborhood protection, and when you begin to want to do those outside of the police or outside of people being in prison or outside of people risking being killed by police when they come onto the scene, one of the things that has to happen is it has to be some type of connection in a neighborhood, or it has to be some type of connection in the community so that people do feel as if they have an invested interest in the kid that's down the street stealing cars, not stealing cars anymore, and doing something more productive with his life, because because in the process of him doing something more productive, it benefits the community as a whole, and that nobody within the community is that you're not okay with just throwing away anybody within the community, or that you're not just okay with throwing away anybody within the neighborhood. But that only comes again with a connectivity to these different people in the community, or these different people in the neighborhood. And so, as we've seen in chapter 2, they talked about some of the impediments to that feeling of connectedness, the impediment of individualism, the impediment of heterogeneity in neighborhoods and different cultures in neighborhoods, people from different backgrounds in neighborhoods. They spoke about the individualism and the fear, all of these different things. And all four of those things are things that can contribute to, if it is a kid somewhere in the neighborhood stealing cars, to people just saying, well, just throw them up and lock away the key, get them out the neighborhood's better off for that. But when you can overcome the fear of your car being stolen, or you can overcome the individual feeling of feeling as if you just rather not have to worry about your car being stolen, so whatever happens to him happens to the kid, doesn't matter. Or if it's a heterogeneity thing and you're a white person in this neighborhood and it's a black kid that's still in the car, since the kid is black, you don't have any empathy for him and you're fine with him just being thrown away or just tossed out. All of those different things have to be overcome to get into a place where when somebody is stealing cars, your reaction to it isn't to just lock them up and throw away the key. And your reaction to it is to find a way to, this person who obviously feels outside of the community or outside of the neighborhood or outside of having the privilege of driving a car or having a car, he feels some type of going through some type of issue. When you are collective and when you are invested in the other people in the neighborhood, or other people in the community, you won't allow him to just be thrown away. You won't allow the state to decide what happens to him. As a community, you will come together and not only try to find ways to address the issue of him stealing the cars, but also try to find ways to absolve the issue of him stealing the cars. And I think one of the things that has to be said about that is that once you can figure that out, once you can understand that, it gets you to a place where when the next person is stealing cars, you can try to implement you can try to implement those practices. Or when the next person is breaking into houses, or when the next person is doing whatever in the community, you can begin to try to implement these practices that you have. And I think that we're so far, and a lot of these things, this is in theory, we're using this concept of the car being stolen because that was one of the things that led the chapter. But I think that in general, this idea of police officers being subservient is one that is how it should be. The police should not be determining how communities are ran. Communities should be determining how they are going to be ran themselves. And because we're not in a place where police are just going to be going tomorrow, since police do exist, they are an evil that is here. The police should be following suit to what the community is deciding, not deciding these things for the community. And again, that's where we get into the legitimacy being brought up. And I think that, and this is my last point before we end this episode, I think that that's one of the reasons why there are certain neighborhoods and certain communities and certain areas and locales where there is high crime or high acts of violence, and there is low cooperation with the police to solve these acts of violence or to solve these crimes, because in those areas the police are not seen as legitimate. In those areas, people as a community decide that they're, or as a neighborhood, or as individuals, collectives, whatever it is, they decide that they are going to handle these things on their own accords, and they're not going to have the police help them with the handling of it because the police have lost their legitimacy in those communities. And so I think those communities especially need to have police officers and need to have state institutions that are subservient to their needs. So we're going to end this episode of Rockford Reading here. Again, we are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power by Steve Herbert. We're on Chapter 3, Episode 41. We about halfway through the book. About halfway through the book. All right, share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these out every day to give people the opportunity every day to begin on their journey to struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and to further their journey on the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We outside.